You're listening to a Moth News podcast.
My name is Rachel Morrogh and I'm Chief Executive of Dublin Rape Crisis Centre.
Amazing, thank you so much. And could you give me a brief outline of what Dublin Rape Crisis Centre does?
Sure. Dublin Rape Crisis Centre was set up in 1979, so we're over 45 years old at this stage. And we were set up as a result of some pioneering women. There was Reclaim the Night marches across the UK and Ireland as a result of a young girl being gang raped, and people sat up and paid attention to that and said, that's not right. We're told that it's because of what girls wear or what they say or what they do, but actually this is a problem about what people are doing to us. And they set up Dublin Rape Crisis Centre, and that first year in 1979, we got 76 calls from people who were affected by sexual violence and rape. But just last year, we took 23,000 calls. So you can see the growth in demand for a service like ours. We're one of 16 rape crisis centres across the country. So there's a rape crisis centre fairly close to everybody across the population, which is a really important resource. But for those who can't maybe get physically to a rape crisis centre, Dublin Rape Crisis Centre runs the National Rape Crisis Helpline, and that's open 365 days a year, 24 hours a day, and accounts for those 23,000 calls. So in terms of what it is that we do, we run that helpline, and we provide counselling and therapy. Last year, we provided 6,000 therapy appointments in Dublin. And we also run an accompaniment service, which accompanies people to the sexual assault treatment unit, to the courts, to the Garda stations. However people need accompaniment as a result of sexual violence, we'll be there every step of the way. We also provide education and training, which is incredibly important, because really, while Dublin Rape Crisis Centre was set up to support people and help people heal after sexual violence, really we can't continue to treat the problem. We need to get in front of it, and we need to start talking seriously about prevention, because sexual violence is something that is 100% preventable. It's one person doing an awful thing to somebody else. So that's part of our dual mission with regard to prevention and healing. There's around 70 people working in Dublin Rape Crisis Centre. We're a very, very busy service, and there's year-on-year growth of around 20%, so very significant.
I just wanted to touch base on two things there that you just mentioned. So when you said the organisation was originally set up, you said that it was because you wanted to dispel the myth of like what people are actually actively wearing or doing. So to my understanding, these are called victim blaming myths. Could you just outline some of those for me, please?
Yeah, so victim blaming myths are very much alive and kicking in Ireland today. We regularly carry out research to establish what the public thinks about victims of sexual violence, about the issue of sexual violence, and we're constantly shocked but not surprised at the findings. For instance, 1 in 5 people in Ireland believe that rape myths, that women make up incidences of rape regularly, which is simply not the case. So sexual violence, it doesn't exist in a vacuum. It exists in an ecosystem that supports sexual violence, and attitudes and beliefs are very much part of that and allow sexual violence to thrive. The government itself has called it an epidemic, which we would agree with. 1 in 2 women and 1 in 4 men will experience sexual violence in their lifetime. And these victim blaming myths keep people silent because there's so much stigma still attached to sexual violence. So although in 1979 there was a view that the victim blaming myths could perhaps be addressed and solved, 45 years later we're still talking about the same thing. And when Lavinia Kerwick first waived her anonymity around the 1990s, she was the first person in Ireland who waived their anonymity after an instance of rape. She spoke about these stigmatizing beliefs, and when you hear people standing on the steps of the court or on a media interview talking about what happened to them, often they reference the fact that the shame and the blame that they felt, which should be experienced by the perpetrator, but is so often carried by the victim. So we really want to address those. We want the attitudes in Ireland and across the globe to change, because that will enable more people to access support, which is so important. And we also think that there are new challenges emerging. Unfortunately, there's new fronts that we're fighting sexual violence on, and these stigmatizing beliefs are coming at us in different ways, particularly online, where the amplification of these victim blaming myths is evident so much at the moment, and is really, really harmful to victims.
Just going back to a previous point you mentioned that you really engage in like therapy. Could you outline what that kind of looks like for a bystander?
Absolutely. So the first place that survivors of sexual violence go is the National Rape Crisis Helpline, and that's very much a signposting service. So if the person who calls wants to access counselling and therapy, then they can make that known to the counsellor at the end of the phone. They come to Dublin Rape Crisis Centre, we talk to them and understand what's happened to them, and then we allow them to access therapy, and however long the therapy needs to go on is provided by Dublin Rape Crisis Centre. And the great thing is that in our service and in services around the country, they're experienced counsellors working in this area, so you really know that you're in the right place with somebody who really understands what you're going through. For some people, 1-2 sessions will be enough. For others, they will undergo years of therapy with Dublin Rape Crisis Centre. It's whatever the person needs, and it's very much a victim-centred service. And as I said, 6,000 appointments were provided last year, so it's a very, very busy service. Unfortunately, we do have a waiting list for counselling and therapy, and that is just evidence of the demand that's out there. We are moving building next year, and we hope that we're going to be able to provide even more therapy appointments year on year, just so that we are able to be there and help people and support them in healing.
Amazing, thank you. And are there also like prevention therapies, i.e. you've identified perpetrators potentially at risk or after the event, that you then try and not retrain, but like help not do the same thing in the future?
That's not something that we do in Dublin Rape Crisis Centre. We're very much about the victim and survivor, but absolutely prevention is a core part of our work. We engage with the general public really, so that they understand about consent, they understand the impacts that sexual violence has on survivors, and we really think that the incidence of sexual violence, there's a possibility there that it could go down, and ideally that it would be eliminated. And that's very much part of the government strategy. So the government strategy is called zero tolerance, and we very much subscribe to that there should be zero tolerance for sexual violence. So prevention is, I suppose, our hope for the future. But until that day of elimination comes, Dublin Rape Crisis Centre and the other rape crisis centres are very much focused on healing.
Amazing, thank you so much. I really love that healing attitude. I just wanted to, if you could please outline for me, let's say somebody has unfortunately been a victim of a sexual assault or a rape. Could you outline the current court processes they'd have to go through and how you currently support them?
The court processes are really difficult for survivors of sexual violence, and they always have been. Improvements have been made, but it's still a very, very arduous process for somebody who's experienced sexual violence. Many cases don't get to the point of trial. We know that in the case of sexual violence, that very few people even make a report to the Gardaí. It's around 5% of people who've experienced sexual violence in their lifetime will go to Gardaí, so a tiny proportion. And of those people, even fewer actually get to trial. So the way that we support victims who do want to make a report is that they can come to us. We'll accompany them to a Garda station so that they can make that first report. Maybe they need to go to the IPO, or maybe they need to go to the WRC, whatever channel that they need to make that report, we'll be there with them. And then during the court process, if that's the point that they get to, we'll sit there every day of their trial and make sure that they understand the process, that they have all the information they need about the court. There's some really practical things that we can help with, like, where's the bathrooms? Where do I sit? When will I go in? And we'll be there. And it's a staff supported service, but we also really rely very heavily on volunteers as well. And these are people who give up their time to help survivors. The court process, though, is very, very difficult. And if you've experienced sexual violence, you're actually only a witness in the criminal trial, and the GPP is the organisation that takes the case. We hear regularly the impact that the court process has on people. Some people have described it as re-traumatizing, and I think that there's so much that could be done to make it a better experience for people, because if people don't feel that the justice pathway is open to them, then there will be many more perpetrators who live lives free from justice, and that's not in anyone's interests. So the court process, we really believe, has to become more victim-centred, and things like having access to counselling notes. This has long been advocated for by Dublin Rape Crisis Centre to bring an end to the routine practice of access to counselling notes. That's just one example, though. There's many instances throughout the court process that makes it difficult for people. But we do need to encourage more people to access justice, because, as I said, that's how we keep perpetrators, to stop them from doing those awful things again.
I completely agree with you. Could you just expand on some of the actual solutions that you think would help in that area? So it's changes that you would like to see, whether they be feasible or not.
Yeah, I think that to come back to the point about sexual violence not existing in a vacuum, one of the best ways that we could encourage more people to access justice is to, first of all, to believe them. I think that one of the reasons why victims of sexual violence don't disclose what's happened to them is because they have this fear of not being believed. They worry that it was in some way their fault. There's a lot of shame and blame associated with sexual violence still. So these are all barriers to people going to that first place, the Garda station, to make a report. But with the support of an organisation like Dublin Rape Crisis Centre, we can help and support and advise, which I think is a big comfort to people, and dispel some of those myths that people feel. The Guards have introduced the DPSU, which is the Divisional Protection Services Unit, which is specially designed to support people who've experienced domestic or sexual violence. And what we're hearing from our clients is that this has made a big difference, which is really, really positive. So that's one thing that's already happened, that you're speaking to somebody who does know how to handle your case, which I think is different from the way it was in the past. But in the court process itself, first of all, there's significant delays in getting to trial, and that's really difficult for people who've experienced type of abuse, that they're waiting for their trial to start. They have to keep on recollecting what happened to them, so that stays fresh in their mind, and so that they're able to testify in a court. And things like the counselling notes, the fact that defence counsel look for counselling notes and other personal records like journals and diaries, we believe that they're primarily used to try and discredit the victim survivor who is going to court. And that type of practice, we need to really consider whether that is in the interests of justice. And given that so few survivors actually take the justice route, I think that we need to really reconsider the way that justice is exercised in Ireland, to make sure that that pathway to justice genuinely is open to everyone, and that includes survivors of sexual violence. Because when you look at the statistics and how few people are taking that route, I would argue that justice perhaps isn't being felt by that group of people, and that's very, very alarming.
I completely agree with everything you've just said there. I think the barriers are terrifying, and also the access to people's notes I wasn't aware of, but that's just inherently wrong in my view. I just wanted to touch base on when you're looking at the media and how we report on sexual violence, what do you think that we do wrong?
I think we carried out research this year, actually, and one of the things that came through very strongly was that the public really believes that the role of the media is very, very important. Thankfully, more people are waiving their anonymity when they do take a case, and you'll regularly see now survivors standing on the steps of the court talking about what happened to them and handing that shame and blame over to the perpetrator. It's really important that the media continues to cover this type of story, that we don't become desensitized to what's happening. I think that it's very important that the public remain shocked at what is happening in homes and offices and laneways and all over Ireland, because if that shock dispels, then I don't think that the urgency that is needed to tackle sexual violence will be felt. So I think the media has a very important role, and that is reflected by what the public think as well. The stories and experiences of survivors of sexual violence needs to be handled very sensitively, though. So while the public needs to remain shocked, what I wouldn't like to see happen is that the experiences of survivors is used in a gratuitous way, and that what happened to them is reported on desensitively or insensitively. I think that we need to make sure that the public understands that actually sexual violence isn't something that happens to somebody else. It's something that happens to very many of us. That fact that 1 in 2 women and 1 in 4 men will experience sexual violence means that survivors are all around us, and we need to be sensitive to that. Part of that is to ensure that the media isn't reporting in a way that might perpetuate those stigmatizing beliefs and victim blaming narratives that are so harmful to survivors. So we would really encourage the media to inform themselves about what a survivor might be feeling and experiencing, and also some basic things like the trigger warnings, that given that so many people have experienced sexual violence, that the media is sensitive to that. One thing that I would love to see come in from the media would be that a trigger warning in print or online media would be at the start of articles rather than at the end. So rather than having to read the article and experience something very negative and then see where you can get support, is that at the top of an article you might see that the National Rape Crisis Helpline, and they give the number, and then you can make a choice about whether you read the article or not. But that's not currently in place, and I'd really like to see that introduced.
In your experience, how many, if you don't want to speak to case data, just anecdotally, are you seeing that it's typically, when people are assaulted, is it typically by people they've known, or just migrants on the street, etc.?
So I think that there are a significant amount of rape myths about who the perpetrator could be or who the victim could be. And the reality is that most people know the perpetrator. Not everybody, but most people do. And that's been the case when we look back at data since it started to be collected, that the biggest risk actually comes from people and that's still the case in Ireland today. So I think that we really need to challenge the rape myths that surround who a perpetrator is and who a victim is. The reality is that anybody can be a perpetrator and anybody can be a victim. And so when we start to understand that, I think that it'll create a much more tolerant environment for survivors to exist in. If they don't think that they are like the victim survivors that are in the media or are online, then they might be more hesitant about seeking help, because they might fear that they wouldn't be believed. They might fear that it was their fault in some way, which of course it never is. And that's really a message that I would love to get out, is that it is never the survivor's fault in any way, and everybody deserves help. And I think that one of the benefits of calling the National Rape Crisis Helpline is that we do have 45 years experience of addressing all kinds of sexual violence. And another message that I'd love to get out there is that it's not necessarily rape, it's all types of sexual violence that we and other rape crisis centres deal with. So if there is somebody out there who does feel hesitant, I would really urge them to make contact with us. And again, the overriding message is that anybody can be a victim, anybody can be a perpetrator, and that once we understand that, I do think that the environment that we all exist in will become a lot more tolerant and a lot more supportive of victim survivors.
Thank you for sharing that. I just wanted to ask you again, in your view, what are like the current biggest barriers to people accessing the court procedures and reporting?
I think that the biggest barrier is around the silence and stigma that still perpetuates sexual violence. The Central Statistics Office did some research on this in 2023, and it found that the biggest barrier to people coming forward was that fear of not being believed. They were also worried that they would be blamed, that it was in some way their fault, and none of these things are true. And I think that recent court cases where maybe the perfect victim hasn't been there. Maybe there were instances of the survivor drinking, taking drugs. These are all things that people do in their everyday lives. And I think that some of the judgments that have come out recently, some of the comments from judges recently around how just because of what it is you wear or what it is that you've done doesn't give anybody license to commit an act of sexual violence and to commit a sexual offence. And those comments are very, very helpful and really start to build the ecosystem that we need to encourage more people to come forward. So I would go back to that point around how people's attitudes and beliefs really are critical in terms of providing that supportive environment that people feel that they can disclose, but also because many people know the perpetrator, it's very difficult for people to make a report about someone they know. It can have devastating consequences in families, in friend groups. And I think that that's a concern for people. So reporting isn't for everyone, but for those who it is and those who want to take that route, we really need to ensure that the justice pathway is genuinely open to them and that they feel that it's open to them. It is a genuine choice about whether they want to proceed that route or not.
How do you think factors like gender, migration status, or somebody's sexuality, or even like religious beliefs can affect their access to the support that you guys offer?
So the Dublin Rape Crisis Centre and all rape crisis centres are open to anybody, regardless of gender, any type of demographic. Dublin Rape Crisis Centre encourages everybody to come and seek support. I think that it's particularly difficult for men to come forward. I think that notwithstanding the awful schools abuse that took place in Ireland, it's still a difficult area for men to acknowledge and to feel that they deserve support for what happened to them. Thankfully, the number of men who are accessing our services is increasing. We now employ a male therapist because some men would prefer to have counselling from a man. So we're really, really delighted that that service is in place. But primarily, the people come to us for support are women. And that does reflect the incidence of sexual violence in Ireland. And I think it's very difficult as well for people who are from minority groups and the LGBTQI plus groups as well, who so deserve support. And we're working with a wonderful survivor, and it is very much his mission to try and turn that around to ensure that people from that community do feel that Dublin Rape Crisis Centre is a place that they can go. They'll get the support they deserve. And again, we'd really encourage them to make contact with us. We can help them heal, that we can try and break down the barriers that do exist and that people suffer every day.
How applicable do you think that lived experience narrative is in the work of DRCC?
It's extremely important. In fact, we've just launched a campaign and it's called Signs of Hope. And it is messages from people who've experienced sexual violence and have benefited from support to the silent majority of people who have never accessed support and have actually never told anyone. So the statistics tell us that around 4 in 5 people who've experienced sexual violence will not use a support service. So the very significant majority will not. And 1 in 2 people who've experienced sexual violence will never tell another person. So there is a huge amount of silence around this issue. I think that it's incredibly important that survivors are given a platform to amplify their messages. And that's something that Dublin Rape Crisis Centre can do. So this campaign is, it's a lovely campaign that is handwritten messages from survivors to other survivors. And we've taken out billboards across the country to try and get that message to the people who really need to hear it. The messages on the billboards are only a line or two, but they're part of a bigger, longer, open letter from the survivor to, as I said, this silent majority. We ran the campaign last year and it had an incredible impact. So the calls that we received from first-time callers increased by almost 80% in the first week we ran the campaign, and overall calls to our helpline increased by a third over the course of the campaign. So we know that messages from survivors to other survivors is one of the best ways that we can use to encourage people to get the support and healing that they need. So we hope that it'll be a campaign that we run for many years. And the sad reality is that there's new survivors every year. Because there is such a prevalence of sexual violence in Ireland. So although the message may not chime with you this year, unfortunately, we need to run it every year so that that new cohort of survivors do hear that message and know where to get the support they need.
When you're looking back over the course of your work with the RCC, have you seen any examples of positive change or hope that you've seen through your work?
Absolutely. I think that the one thing that has really struck me since I started working DRCC is the hope that every person who comes to DRCC has hope, and that's why they're with us. They believe in healing, they believe in a more positive future, they believe that they're in the right place. What worries me is the significant majority of people who are not in contact with a support service. But the survivors who come to DRCC, all of them speak about hope. And I think that that's what keeps us going. It's what keeps us pushing for change. It's because we believe that change is possible. And I think that that is all entangled with hope. And every day of the week, we see people who are on that healing pathway, and it may take years, it could take decades, but it is possible. And I also believe that the elimination of sexual violence is possible, and that is a very motivating thing to believe. And I think that it's the burning platform that I and my colleagues really feel that we're on, that there's the opportunity to eliminate this awful epidemic. But what we need to ensure is that everybody feels that urgency, and that all these harmful myths and beliefs that we're seeing amplified by social media, that we find a way to get in front of those, and that, as I said earlier, Oscar, those new fronts that we're fighting sexual violence on, that we shut them down, and that the future for all of us is more positive than it was for the people who are currently in the care of Dublin Rape Crisis Centre.
Thank you. Sorry, just on the social media side, could you explain what you kind of seeing when you look at social media for areas that you know that you need to combat?
I think that one of the main areas, and I think that everybody knows this, is the amplification of misogynistic messaging, of messaging that supports sexual violence, that tolerates sexual violence. And it's not just online. If you think about some of the world leaders, the world's political leaders, they do not have a history that is clean in this area of sexual violence. And I think that creates a tolerance of this issue. And I'm really, really worried about that, because as I said earlier, I think that we need to remain shocked by sexual violence, but I worry that perhaps that is not happening. And I think that some of the world's leaders validate some of that messaging that we see online, and actually they are just they can create a situation whereby sexual violence is seen as acceptable, and it's seen as an intractable problem, whereas in fact I would argue that it is anything but that. It is something that we can get in front of, it's something that we can solve, and it's something that we can eliminate. So all those messages that we see online, they exist because we allow them to exist, and social media companies are not doing enough to shut them down. And I don't think governments are doing enough to shut them down. I think that there's a lot of hand wringing, and it's almost like the government leaders are just reading the news, that it's someone else's problem, that they know that it exists, but they don't feel that they're the ones who can address it on behalf of all of us, on behalf of the population. And I think that we need to be much, much, much stronger in this area, and that we need to regulate, and we need to regulate effectively and robustly. And unfortunately, the genie is already out of the bottle, and we are dealing, certainly in Dublin Rape Crisis Centre, we're dealing with the downstream effects of a lack of regulation. And we see awful things happen to our clients, and we think that the online world is part of that problem, and part of the problem that tolerates sexual violence. So I think that we need government action. I think we probably need much more action at a European level as well. It's not just the national government who needs to do more, but it needs to be led by Europe as well. But unfortunately, action has not been taken to date, and I think that some of the survivors who we work with have felt the impact of that.
Anything I haven't asked you that you feel you would like to share onto a wider platform? Could you please let me know what that is?
Just like survivors to know that even if they never reach out for help, that Dublin Rape Crisis Centre sees them. We know that they're out there. We believe them. And even if they don't want to reach out to us and get the help and support that is there, that we do wish them every good wish. And as I said, we do see them, and we know that they're there, and we hope that they have as best a life as they can. And if they do get to the point at some stage in the future where they do want to reach out for help, then Dublin Rape Crisis Centre is there, no matter when the incident of sexual violence took place. It could be decades later. It doesn't matter. It doesn't matter what gender you are, who the perpetrator was, or what happened. The National Rape Crisis Helpline is open 24 hours, 365 days a year, and the number is 1-800-77-88-88.